Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today. We're just going to wait another minute or two to let everyone to have the chance to sign on, so please sit tight. Hi, everyone. My name is Olga Kernikos, and I'm the Senior Marketing Director here at Credo. Before we begin, there are a few housekeeping items I'd like to go through. So if you can hear me okay, please use the raise hand option located on your control panel. Great. There will be a recording of the webinar shared via email within 24 hours. And at the conclusion of today's session, there will be a short survey that you will be directed to as well. Throughout the webinar, we'll be conducting a few polls. So when prompted, please choose the best answer to the question you will see on your screen. If you have a question for me or any of the panelists during the webinar, please use the chat portion of your control panel. If you have any questions that you would like Dan to respond to at the end of the session, please use the Q&A portion to submit those, and we'll get to as many questions as we can by the end of the session. So again, thank you for joining us for Lost in the Information Landscape, helping students find their bearings with Credo. Today, Dan Chibnall of Drake University will share strategies for teaching students to navigate information using Credo Online Reference Service, including working with the mind map tool, how he uses Credo to help teach searching as a strategic exploration from the ACRL framework, and how to use Credo to see how research sits inside a net of other research. So Dan will also discuss lesson plans, activities, and assessment tools he's used when teaching his course on information literacy. So we have a lot to get through, so I'll turn it over to Dan at this point. Take it away, Dan.
Okay, thank you very much, Olga. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you have better weather than we do here in Iowa right now. Mother Nature is really throwing everything at us today, so I'm glad to be inside. My plan for today is to kind of take you through not just how I use Credo Reference, but also a little bit about the origins of the course that I teach, how some of the other courses and how they kind of integrate with it, and some of the concepts and skills that I try to get across to students, what I do in my job. So I want to make sure that I don't take up the whole hour. I want to make sure that we leave some time for questions. That way people can kind of dig down, because I know that there's no way for me to convey everything in 30 minutes. So I will welcome and appreciate any follow-up emails or phone calls or Twitter questions you might have afterwards, and hopefully we can get some answers for all of you. So what does our afternoon look like? Well, what I want to start with is just sort of what our plan is. So I want to start today with the background of my course, Fake News, Filters, and Falsehoods, talk to you a little bit about that and what we focus on. And then I will segue into kind of the initial problems that I identified when I was teaching this course. And these problems are not just problems that I've seen in this course, but in other courses and in working with faculty and working with students doing their own research. I will then show you some demoing. I'll have some basic slides here and there, but I'm mainly going to be inside of the Credo service and kind of show you how I use it. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the results that I've seen in my students' work and some of the takeaways and things that I plan to do in the future, and then make sure that I have some time to leave so you can ask plenty of questions. So like I said, I won't be able to touch on everything in the next 30 minutes or so, but I want to make sure that you write down some questions, have some thoughts, and we'll get to those at the end. So let's go to our first slide here, and I'll tell you a little bit about myself and this course. So I'm the STEM librarian here at Drake University, and I work at Cole's Library. That's our main library here. And we have a team of instruction librarians, and they work very closely with faculty and different students in those departments throughout the semester. Now, the instruction librarians also teach a lot of their own standalone courses, and we have the freedom to design them around any content that we like, as long as we're meeting what are called the areas of inquiry here at Drake. So these are things like information literacy, engaged citizenship, writing, those kinds of things. So students can take a variety of courses in their time at Drake to meet these AOIs. And so I teach 3 courses throughout the year. These are all courses that I've designed from a little bit of previous teaching experience at a former institution, but I've completely developed these here at Drake. And so the 3 courses are, one is a first-year seminar called Science Fiction, Science Fact. And so we use science fiction to sort of delve into what is good science, what is quality science, how can science predict or warn us, how can it inspire us. I also am currently teaching, actually this spring semester, an information literacy course called Communicating Science. So we kind of talk about different ways of taking complex technical scientific literature and making it accessible to the general public through various means, social media, journalism, podcasts, videos, good writing, good quality, creative nonfiction writing. And then there's this course, Fake News, Filters, and Falsehoods, Navigating Information Literacy in the 21st Century. So this course is a course that I teach in the January term here at Drake. And our J term is for sophomores through seniors. They're completely, they're elective, so none of them are required. But students often take them to meet a certain AOI. And it gives the faculty an opportunity to design some courses that are more interdisciplinary and sort of liberal artsy, if you will. So we don't just focus on one particular type of content. We kind of reach across different disciplinary aisles. And so this course was born out of some research and sort of professional interests and hobbies that I had had for years about information behavior, information consumption, how technology sort of affects the way that we consume and analyze information. Kind of the screen effect, the smartphone, smart tablet kind of effect on information behaviors. And then the 2016 election came around and everybody was talking about fake news. And so I sort of saw this as a way to combine these interests that I had with misinformation and information overload and sort of wrap it around these concepts that everybody was talking about in the popular press. And so I designed the course and started offering it, and students have really enjoyed it because we focus on a variety of different concepts. So the 3 big concepts we look at here in this course are fake news / misinformation. So we make sure to unpack what that means. Information overload, so how we're basically being hit with a fire hydrant of information in the modern day. And then engaged citizenship, so how those things kind of blend together to affect the way that we think and speak and behave in a democratic republic. So how do we engage as citizens when we are being overloaded with information and misinformation, and what does that do to our democracy? So I'm going to spend the next 3 slides just telling you a little bit more about the course and then getting into some of the things that I do with Credo that help the students a lot. So when we focus on misinformation, this is something that we do early in the semester. And the January term is an intensive course. So I should tell you that right away, every J-term class is 3 weeks long. So we meet usually anywhere from 15 to 16 days. And the course meets 3 hours every day. So my class is 9 to 12 every day from early January to the end of January. And so misinformation is the first thing that we focus on. And so we look at this great, we kind of build our own, and then I introduce the students to this great sort of spectrum that you see here from Claire Wardell's Fake News It's Complicated article. And we sort of talk about motivation and deception, and we kind of unpack the concept of fake news, because people often think of it as sort of this binary thing of either news is real or news is fake. And I always remind the students that that's not how life works. Life is on a spectrum. And so we use this as sort of a jumping off point to talk about how do we separate fact from fiction, and what are some strategies that we use to sort of navigate our way through misinformation. So, some of the solutions that we work on with assignments and activities are things like lateral reading, sort of moving away from what used to be called the CRAP test and more towards lateral reading, using the network of previously confirmed information. learning how to slow down when we're consuming information so we don't retweet something or post something that later on we find out is completely untrue. We look at logical fallacies and how to recognize them and how we defend against them and what we say in response to them. We work on making sure not to rely too heavily on social media for news, making sure we go straight to a journalistic source instead. We look at ways of recognizing bias, examining our own personal filters. So that's a word that comes up quite a bit in the class. Everything that we consume information-wise is going to come through some kind of a filter. So the students are asked often to sort of look at what are the filters in their everyday lives that basically create their own personalities and conceptions of the world. And then we also look at echo chambers, and I'll come back to those a little bit later when we're looking at Credo material. We also focus on information overload. So we work to look at cognitive biases, which here's a whole bunch of them right here. How the impact of technology, how it affects our information behaviors, so how we seek out information, how we sometimes have sort of selection bias when we're choosing certain things for information sources. We examine what I like to call information moods. So what times of day are you consuming, you're scrolling, you're analyzing, you're writing. We have different times in the day where we're very busy or have free time. And so how do we basically take the information that we're gathering and learning about, and what do we do with it, and are we doing it at the right time of day? And we also look at things like social media's role tied in with concepts like the Overton window. We talk about Marshall McLuhan and his famous text, "The medium is the message." And we look at just kind of how fast-paced information creates a subconscious demand for more information. And then we get into things like multitasking, skimming, and the attention deficit model of information behavior. So I try to make sure that the students are aware of the problems that might be kind of creeping into their lives as a result of so much information overload. And then finally in the course, we focus on how this all affects us as members of a society. So how does it affect us as voters, as people who want to support our local communities, as voting members of a nation state? How do we know that we have the best information? So how does information sort of reside within a community at the local, state, and national level? What kinds of information do we need to be engaged citizens? And so some of the things we look at here are like political bias, news organizations, nonprofits, advocacy work, volunteerism, the role of the student on campus and off campus as an engaged citizen. And we also look at concepts related to pseudoscience. One of the books that we actually read is Carl Sagan's Demon Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark. Because a lot of the problems that revolve around fake news and misinformation are actually very similar to the things that kind of misfire in our brains when it comes to cognitive biases, logical fallacies, and the belief in pseudosciences. So things that don't really make sense according to our modern view of the world. So some of the assignments I have the students do, they do traditional analysis papers where they kind of find evidence and make an argument and break different concepts down from the course. Self-examination papers, kind of reflecting on some of their learning. But the most important ones that I have them do, I call awareness and action papers. And these are really helpful because what they ask the student to do is to sort of identify what they've become aware of in their own lives as it pertains to like information overload or misinformation or their own filters. So what are they now aware of? Like one student did a paper on this concept called source amnesia, how we tend to remember information that we heard, read, or saw, but we don't remember where we saw, heard, or read it. So we remember the information, but we don't remember who or what said it or published it. And so then the action part of the papers is, what's the student going to do about it? So how are they going to teach this to somebody else? How are they going to fix the problem in their own life? What are they going to do about it a week from now, 6 months from now, 2 years from now? So it helps them to connect what they're learning with something in their lives. So at this point, I want to shift gears a little bit and ask you a question because I want to get into the problems that I was seeing in my course. And so we're going to send out a poll question here and basically ask you, do your students have difficulties determining scope when they're starting their research? that's kind of what I thought. When we did this previously too, it was very similar numbers. So this is something that I don't just see in the fake news course. It's also something I see in courses, the other courses I teach, and then when I work as an embedded librarian with a lot of the natural sciences departments. Students simply, they choose topics that are way too broad. They're having trouble focusing, narrowing the scope. You know, they might say like, I'm going to write about fake news, or I'm going to write about voting rights. And it's like, well, those are really big concepts. And so what I found was that, you know, this is something we really have to tackle. And the reason we have to tackle it is because if students start too broadly, then they procrastinate on the assignment itself because they're unfamiliar with it. They feel uncomfortable, they feel frustrated by it because they don't understand it. They don't know where to go with it. They end up doing a lot of blanket searching instead of, you know, doing more precise searching. And so they don't really have a plan or a model or any goals with their assignment, even though I kind of give them a really strong prompt of how to think about it. So what I often start by doing is I remind the students that good writing is an example of good thinking. So you've got to have organized thinking before you can start writing. And so what we do is we start thinking about mental maps and outlines before we begin to do any research. So I start having students write down 3 general or broad concepts or ideas to begin a class period. And then these are the topics that, you know, that maybe they might research later on. So what we do then is we get into these mind maps. So I want to ask you another question now that pertains to the scope of when you're doing one of these, when you're working with another faculty member or a class. You know, how many of you create an assignment or some kind of an activity that asks students to think about narrowing or forming some kind of an initial thesis statement? Okay, good. A little bit of a mix, and I see some rarelies in there, so that's good. That means there's some room for building here. So what are we doing? Well, I want the students to think kind of like some of these mental maps early on that Credo uses within their reference tool. So I want the students to think about building a foundation of interrelatedness. I want students to basically come up with lots of terminology, authorities, you know, people, research that they can build off of and have that confidence and that comfort and familiarity. So that way when they get to the next stage of the research process, they're actually interested in it and they don't see it as some gigantic wide open field that they're going to get lost in. So what we do is we kind of jump into Credo reference and start exploring the terminology and start building an outline or map of what we're finding. So I want every student to kind of flesh out their big broad topics so they can start to see what kind of research to focus on. And then once we've done all that, then they can jump into the next stage of the research. So I want to show you kind of what I'm talking about here by taking you into Credo and showing you some of the examples. So before we get started too, if you haven't seen these yet, these little videos down here at the bottom about getting from research question to conclusion, these new videos are actually quite helpful and they'll pop up throughout the results. So if you run into one of those, show those to your students and take a watch yourself. They're pretty helpful. So let's say we wanted to look at one of our concepts like information overload. So I'm just going to do a basic search for that. So when we do this search, we get these entries, which is nice, and we'll come back a little bit later and take a look at these key concepts. But the focus right now that I like for the students to get used to is by looking at these maps, because these maps are really helpful. So not only do you get these entries that sort of define some of the terms and give you sort of a general idea of other terminology that's related, but you also get to see some things that will help you brainstorm. So right away, we see things like attention span, attention management, time management, civic engagement, and civic engagement, engaged citizenship is one of our concepts. So then you can sort of jump over and see, okay, so this is related to information overload in some way. And then you might say, well, I don't really know what that term means, or what can I use that term for? So we can come over here to where the definition is and just open this up and start to get some ideas about what we're talking about. So if a student's coming into a class and, you know, I have students from psych departments, I have biology students, I have journalism students, because these classes are all interdisciplinary. So they don't really know often what some of these blanket terms are. So now they can come in here and start to generate some more ideas. So I get the students to think about building their own mind maps with more searches, more key terms, and more names. And so once they have this, they can then jot down some thoughts on, okay, so I see, education is in here. So how does education relate to civic engagement, engaged citizenship? How does that relate back to misinformation and fake news? And they're starting to build some very early pathways between these terms. So another example might be, I might have a student who's interested in looking at like cognitive biases, but they're kind of overwhelmed by the sheer number of them or what they are or how they work. So what I do is I have the students, use the mind map and also some of the key concepts to sort of generate a list of what those biases are and come up with some, instant definitions. And then I would encourage them to go find like an author or two who has done research on these biases. So let me give you an example. So like if we come back up here and we search for cognitive biases, so right away we see our map come up again. And, right away, we see the Dunning-Kruger effect. We see Daniel Kahneman. We see the availability heuristic. So right away, you don't really know who's this guy or what's this effect, or I don't know what this term means. Well, that's where Credo really comes in handy, because now the student has something that they can go off of. So if we want to look at the Dunning-Kruger effect and find out what that is, we can click on it, and it will give us a definition that we can read about and see, okay, what does this mean, right? So right now I'm getting a little spinny wheel. There we go. So the Dunning-Kruger effect finally comes up here, and what we have is a nice definition. And so we see it's named after the discoverers of it, how long it's been around, and what it means. And so this is not just helpful with helping the students narrow down, but it also is helpful because it gives them more control over what they're interested in and helps them to select rather than just sort of guessing or going down a path that they're not interested in. So right away, they're collecting. They're kind of throwing a net out there and collecting as much information to see what interests them and what doesn't. So when we start building these maps, I tell students that we pick out some of the related, so one of the activities that we do that's kind of related to this, in class, we'll pick out some of the related terms and work in pairs and groups to determine how the two or more terms are related. So cognitive biases, Dunning-Kruger effect, how is Dunning-Kruger related to critical thinking or overconfidence? And what I ask the students to do is to put it in their own language, because I often tell them that if you can explain something to someone else in clear, concise language, then you have a much better understanding of it than you did, say, an hour ago, a day ago, or a week ago. So these activities really help the students, and there's often laughter because people have trouble trying to, dictate what they're trying to say. They think they get it, but they don't always get it. And so when they work in pairs, it's a little bit easier for them to see, okay, I should try using this language instead. So another example would be, if a student is researching something like confirmation bias, I'll have the students in the pairs pull up the entry for that in Credo, and then they'll listen to the student researching it, explain it in their own words, see how well they do. And I don't want them to memorize anything, but rather to kind of articulate it in their own style, their own words, to make sure that it makes sense. So this helps to solidify their understanding. So let's take another look at what we can do with this. So let's try doing a basic search up here. And let's just try doing a very blanket general topic like fake news. So when we do a search for fake news, right away we see this topic page come up. And these topic pages are great because it gives the students a sense of what's out there, but it also gives them these relational pages. And this is kind of like how the map works. So I want the students to think about how is fake news related to journalism, obviously. Propaganda, that's a term that we look at, and what are the differences between propaganda and misinformation and disinformation and satire. And then we also get down into the nitty-gritty of something like crowd psychology. So this is really good because we do another activity where we will explore one of these concepts. So we'll get the students into groups, and then they have to sort of relate other concepts to this concept. So they basically have to say, okay, what things have we learned about recently that relate to crowd psychology? So we're kind of narrowing down a little bit. And this is where students start to come up with terms like echo chambers, media filters, crowdsourcing, online tribes. And by doing that activity, the students are generating new topics of interest that then they can go and research. So this leads us into a discussion of, what do those terms mean, and what kinds of research should we look at to learn more about them? At this point, too, I also have the students kind of reflect on how we got to this point in the research and in Credo. So we go back through our process of searching, and it helps the students to kind of see, oh, that's how I got to this. That's how this is helpful for me. So let's do another search here for a moment, and let's take a look at something that the students are often very interested in, and that's confirmation bias. So when we do a confirmation bias search, we get quite a few results. And this is where I remind the students that, limiting their searches is very helpful. So, and I have students coming from many different backgrounds. So doing a search like confirmation bias and then limiting it to psychology, then they can look at it through that lens. And so when we do that, then this is where I tell them, not only are you limiting it with the subject area, but you're also getting these really great key concepts down here. So now students can go and find out, okay, so what is selection bias? What is the availability heuristic, right? What do we mean by these terms? So it gives them even more ammo that they can then go out and do more searching on. And so when they start to do this and we work on this in class, I'll have each student kind of show me, kind of at our break in the mornings, which one of these tools did you use and how was it helpful to you? So that way I know that they're using it in the class period and sort of using it for some of their homework too. And that way I know they're using the mind map, they're using the subject limiter, they're using the key concepts. And that way it helps to help them build that foundation, that base of ideas. So let's do one more set of searches real quick and take a look at pseudoscience. So this is often something that students have heard about, but they don't really understand what it means. So when we look at pseudoscience, we're trying to make connections between, okay, why do people fall prey to misinformation? Well, it's often the same reason that people fall prey to things like pseudoscience. So this kind of ties in with information literacy, because what we're doing is we're unpacking the term and we're looking at the differences between when something is scientific and when something is pseudoscientific. So it gives the students an opportunity to create criteria of, oh, okay, I see, this is science when it does A, B, C, and D. And they're often surprised to see words like acupuncture come up. They're not usually surprised to see astrology, but the point of these exercises with pseudoscience isn't to try and mock or make fun, but rather to ask ourselves, okay, what makes those things not scientific? And then we jump into that. So we look at the scientific method, and then we start to figure out, oh, wow, these are the same skills that we would be using to like examine a source for misinformation or examining a source through an information literacy lens. So does this meet my criteria? Is it published in a good journal? Is it published by somebody who knows what they're talking about? So doing something like this allows the students to use all of these Credo tools, but also to ask really good critical thinking questions. Now, one of the last searches I want to do today is for one of my favorite logical fallacies, and the students end up liking this one a lot too. And you're going to see 0 results here, and that's on purpose, because I use this as a learning opportunity for the students that you don't always find what you want right away. And so, what is whataboutism? Well, it's kind of a kooky logical fallacy. And if you do a little more research on it, you find out that it actually has a different name in Latin. Yes, Latin, there are a lot of Latin logical fallacies, but they've been around in humanity for so long, that's why they still have Latin names. So when we do a search for to quoque like this, we realize, okay, so this is what it's called. So what this means is that sometimes terms are not always what you think they are. And so when we look at the to quoque logical fallacy on the map, you can see some of the other things that are related to it. So then students can learn, okay, what does this mean? How does this relate to whataboutism? And then how can you go from there? So I make sure that they're thinking about terminology and that there are often different ways to get to the same point. So that's just a little bit of how I use the Credo reference tool, because it helps the students to build that foundation, and it's kind of a spark. It gives the students a spark to light a fire that then they can go do something with. They can carry that fire forward and really, brighten some of their other work, to extend the metaphor there for a moment. But that's really what I'm trying to get them to think about is, build a nice foundation and feel comfortable with the topics that they want to research. So now I want to talk a little bit about the framework and also some of the results and takeaways that I got from all of this work. So I don't literally teach the students the framework. I don't think that that's the right way to go about doing it. This is all behind the scenes, but what I try to do is use elements of the framework as a jumping off point for activities, lessons, and learning outcomes. Since much of what I do with Credo deals with narrowing and scope and focus, I like to make sure I find every instance of that in the framework and look at the surrounding concepts to see how I can tie those in to future lessons and outcomes. So I will often rephrase the language of the framework and present it as a general discussion question in class and see if I can get the students to come up with some of their own versions of the knowledge, practices, and dispositions. Now, I don't go into class and say, okay, kids, let's talk about the framework, or here's a framework discussion. I don't tell them anything about that. I simply use these as sort of ways of getting the students to think about, how do I do this in my research practice? How do I do this with my homework, right? So I'm kind of getting them to reverse engineer something that they don't even know exists to begin with. And it's really amazing how close we come to some of this type of language on our own, just by trying to lead the students there. So I think it's important to keep the framework in mind and to think about, what tools you have at your disposal, like Credo, that you can then use in tandem with some of these concepts. Because we go through the whole framework as much as we can, but there's only so much time in the day. And so I try to pick out the things that I think are most helpful. So the final slide here, talking about, helping students think about beyond Credo. So Credo gives us that foundation. It helps us to think sort of with the mental map. And so what the students did, they did a really excellent job of building these brainstorm maps, and I would have them do outlines and sort of relational charts, because I want to see their thinking. I want to see how they're organizing themselves early on. So once students had built these, I had them kind of pick one or two of them and begin searching for more specific or particular studies or books or book chapters. And once students had a foundation to work off of, they had an increased sense of confidence and really began digging deeper to find related sources and authorities. So at this point, I would show them the Search Other Sites option within Credo Reference so they could jump their search out to another library resource. So this helped them to start looking elsewhere for some of the new concepts and ideas that they had found. And once they'd done this, I had them get into groups during the next class period to share their process with each other. And so during this activity, I would encourage each member of the group to give positive advice to each other member so that they might be able to do something new next time and build on those online resources to really see how they can be helpful. And so when students are doing this, I'm trying to get them to think about research kind of like that map, right? That brainstorm map. I'm reminding them that a lot of this research sits within one of those nodes. A good article within Web of Science, a good article within JSTOR, a good article within PsycInfo. It doesn't sit in a vacuum, right? There's going to be a reference list, and somebody is going to have cited this paper, in the past. So I get the students to think about how not just their terms and concepts and ideas sit within a brainstormed network of other ideas, of relational material, but I get them to think about how the end products, the published material, also sits within a web. And so I get them to think about the context of that and not just think about a paper sitting by itself or a book sitting by itself. So we often use these tools, jumping out from Credo, and then using that as a way to find all this other stuff and thinking about how it's related either through a reference list or through a time-cited list. So when the students submit a formal outline to me based on these initial explorations, I make sure to give them feedback on it so that way they're narrowing their scope appropriately. And the final research projects that are born out of this were much more specific and had appropriate scope compared to the broadly written papers I had seen in the past. So that was really helpful, getting the students to use Credo right away so they could build that foundation, build that floor, and then start to work and find other stuff based on that. So in the future, I kind of want to work more of the information literacy framework into this process, get more of the authority as constructed and contextual in there. And it really helps me to give the students guidelines and advice as they move forward with the narrowing of their topics. And I think any instruction librarian could easily work this into their own course or adapt a shorter version of it into a one-shot or an embedded course. the most important point is to emphasize that the students, that once you establish a foundation of what you're interested in and narrowing it down, the rest of the research can really be enjoyable and not be seen as just such a gigantic obstacle. So having a proper scope really helps the mind to focus and stay on track. So with that, like I said, I can't cover everything that I do, but I wanted to make sure that you kind of saw where my course comes from, what I do, problems I had, how I tried to solve those problems, and the results that came out of it. So I really appreciate you attending today and listening. This is my contact info. Feel free to contact me on any of those platforms. This is the wonderful Mr. Griff. He is our live mascot here at Drake University. He is beloved by all. So I often end my presentations with a picture of him, because who doesn't love a bulldog? So I'll let Olga or Kristen come back in, and we'll hopefully take some questions.
That was great, Dan. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We've got a bunch of questions lined up here, so I'll get started. And if anybody else does have questions, please just submit them in the Q&A box, and I'll put them over to Dan. So the first one we have is, can you elaborate on how you made the connection from whataboutism and to quote?
Sure. So sometimes, like when I'm getting my lesson plans together, I try to work in both canned searches, but also sort of like like, oh, that didn't work kind of searches, because I like for the students to see that librarians, we often don't always know the answer, and so we have to go out and search for things. So like when I was first learning about whataboutism a long time ago, I basically happened upon the fact that, oh, this logical fallacy has another name, and this is it. And so what I try to remind the students is that sometimes, if you're in a database, if you're in a particular resource and you're not getting any results, well, maybe it's time to broaden out, do a quick Google search, and see what some of the other words are. And so I always remind them, I don't know, I'm 37 years old, so I don't know if this is still something that people say, but I often tell them, you say potato, I say potato. So not everybody's going to use the same terminology. So that's why sometimes a quick Google search can be helpful in establishing other terminology for that thing. Another example I use with students, especially in my health science classes, is a lot of students always want to do research on steroids in sports. Well, yeah, you can do that, but the terminology isn't just steroids in sports. In fact, the term that often gets used is doping. But that's not the intuitive word that we often come to, because that's not the word that gets used a lot in the mainstream media. So I remind the students that sometimes you need to do a little bit of a general search to find out what is the potato version of this thing. And so that's kind of where I got from whataboutism to quote.
All right. How about, do you have any particular tips or steps for students trying to develop their thesis statement or research question?
Yes. So the first thing I often tell students is that some of them come in and they think that they need to figure out their thesis statement right away, and then the thesis statement like never changes. And I always remind them that no, that the thesis statement should kind of be like your North Star. So yeah, it's going to be there and you should follow it, but it does still move a little bit, and it's going to disappear, from time to time. And so it's your guiding light, but it doesn't need to be fixed from day one. So nothing really is truly fixed. So you want it to be a sort of guidepost as you go. And so I remind them that what that basically means is you're going to have drafts of your thesis. And so what I do early in the semester is sort of a little activity where I show them how to break a broad idea down from broad concept all the way down to sort of like a draft thesis, or sometimes what I call a proto-thesis. And so the process kind of works like this. And I remind the students that, people can have different methods. This is just one that's worked for me over the years and for teaching other students. So what I do is I start with something broad, like, I'll say, maybe you're going to do something on the environment, okay? So then after that, you kind of go down to something narrowed. Okay, what about the environment? Maybe you want to look at pollution. Okay, so that's narrower. Now I tell them restrict it. So restrict it by adding something else. Okay, pollution. What's a form of pollution? Oil spills. Okay. So now you have the environment, pollution, and oil spills. So you've got three concepts. Ask a question. Ask a question that you're interested in finding the answer to. And that answer is your proto-thesis. So your question might be, how significantly do oil spills affect a local ecosystem? And then your early answer, based on very early research or just what you know, might be, oh, oil spills have decades-long effects on local ecosystems. Okay, well, there you go. That's a claim. That's a statement. That's something you can work with. Now, that's not going to be your final thesis, but it's going to be your guiding light. So now go and do more research to find out, okay, what kind of time frame are we talking about? What kinds of things can we do to learn about the problems with oil spills? So as you learn things, your thesis is going to morph. It's going to change, just like your introduction will, because that's going to be the preview to your paper. I always remind students that writing an introduction should be one of the last things you do, because it's like introducing somebody to somebody else. You can't introduce a stranger to somebody you know, because you don't know the stranger. You have to get to know them, just like you have to get to know a topic before you can introduce it, right? So I tell the students, write your introduction last, because then at the very end is when you know everything that you can about a topic. So that's kind of an early practice that we do to kind of go from broad all the way down to sort of an answer to a research question.
Great, and we got a couple questions about how to use your methods amongst different types of groups. So maybe you could speak to any that you've worked with. How would you maybe change your course or some of the methods to meet the needs of online students or graduate level or even ESL students?
Sure. So probably the one I can work with, the one I've worked with the most in that group is online students. So I don't work with them very much, but I don't really work with grad students. I don't really work with ESL students, but I can at least touch on the online part. And it's kind of similar to what I did today. I do a lot of demoing. I make sure to give students access to brief demo videos of kind of so if you're trying to use like a limiter and you're trying to narrow something down a little bit, here's a 1 minute 30-second video on 2 ways you can do that. And so I'll use like an example from the content of the course that we're working in, and then say, okay, look for these limiters. Here's what you can do. And then I put those up on like Blackboard or Panopto or whatever we're using for that. So I try to create very brief, concise examples of how you can use some of the tools, and make sure that I'm tying it in with some kind of a skill. So it's not just here's a tool, here's a tool, here's a tool. It's more like here's a tool and we're using it because. I do that a lot with my assignments and activities with students. I always provide the students with a rationale. So when I give them the prompt for an assignment, the first thing they're going to read is the rationale and goals, because I want the students to know that I'm having them do this for X, Y, and or Z reasons. And I don't want them to think I'm just having them do it, because I'm having them do it. I want them to know the reasons behind it. So what are the learning options? So when I create these little videos, I make sure that the students know here's a tool, but here's the skill that's tied with it. So here's why we're using that tool and why it can be helpful to us, and how we can then use that in, say, another database or another type of tool further on down the road.
All right, and how do you balance the web / Wikipedia / Google research that's understood and used by first-year students with Credo and controlled language?
How do I balance it?
Yeah, so how do you, I guess the question is more about kind of working with both. I know you already mentioned one example of starting with Google.
Yeah.
Any other recommendations?
Yeah, so one of the first things I tell students when it comes to some of those general things like Google and Wikipedia is that, first of all, contrary to what they may have been told in high school, especially for first-year students, do not think that there's no blanket rule that you can't use these resources. And so what I try to do is tell the students, let's define the word use. And I know this sounds like a philosophy class now, but I think it's important because sometimes they get an assignment from another instructor, and we see these in the library sometimes, where it'll say, do not use this. And it's like, well, what does that mean? Do not use Wikipedia. So I tell them, you can use Google, you can use Wikipedia, but be careful how you're using them. Like, Wikipedia can be helpful for at least getting a base understanding of what something is. You know, if your professor in a bio class, you know, spent a lecture talking about, you know, pollution and chemical pollution, and the word benzene came up a couple times, and you're like, I don't know what benzene is. Well, at least Wikipedia will give you a general understanding of what it is. Now, what I then tell them is, don't cite Wikipedia, but if you're going to get a base understanding, you can use that. That's okay, because then now you know something, and you can go in and do another search in something more established. Or use a reference list on something that you find, because you don't always know who the author is. So, but at least the references, you can go out and check those yourself. You can go out and see, oh, this is from the NIH, or this is from the CDC, or this is from the EPA, or anything like that. So I try to get them to think about using these things in tandem with the more established tertiary sources, rather than just having a blanket rule of you can only use one website or you can only use one Wikipedia article, because then we're really narrowing down what we mean by the word use. So I try to get them to think about it in terms of research habits, and not necessarily about like resource A, resource B, you can only use A, you can't use B. And what I find is that then they do that. They use it, but they don't heavily rely on it. So I also, in my assignments, sort of have requirements about, I make sure that at least a certain percentage of their resources are what I call scholarly or high quality material, depending on what type of research they're doing. So it has to be authored by a professional in that field, or it has to have a reference list, or there's a whole bunch of other criteria that I put in the rubrics. So that helps them to then have a baseline of like, okay, I should have at least this much quality material in there. So that's kind of how I approach that. I hope that helps answer the question a little bit.
Yeah, and we did get a comment just appreciating you addressing that rule of do not use that instructors put out there. So
oh yeah,
it's kind of that same boat.
Oh yeah, when I've been to conferences before, there's always kind of a collective groan when somebody mentions that as part of their presentation. It's like, yeah, we've all been there, yeah. Or my favorite is when they say, do not use online web resources or something like that. And it's like, what does that even mean? Like, are we supposed to just use like print journals? Like, that doesn't make sense.
Off to the stacks.
Right, yeah.
All right, and how about, do you have better results in class with trying out canned questions in Credo, ones you've researched ahead of time, or kind of working on the fly with student-generated keyword searches?
Sure. So I mentioned before that one thing I like to do with students is I'm not afraid to show them that it's okay to fail or to not get the desired search results. You know, sometimes people often think like, oh, you know, so-and-so, they messed up their demo because the thing isn't showing up. But, you know, that's just how we work, you know, and as a science person, I always remind them too that a lot of what you do, especially in the sciences, is trial and error. So I always make sure to have a mixture of both canned searches that I know are going to work because I want to get to a certain point. I can't dawdle the whole class period trying to find that one good article. So I will have some canned searches, but at the same time, I like to show them, okay, let's throw a topic up there and let's explore. And I'm not trying to turn them into librarians, but I'm trying to give them a sense of, here's what you do when you hit a wall. You know, try this, right? So it's kind of a flow chart in a way. It's like, if this, then that. If not this, then don't do this, right? And so that way they get a sense of comfort, again, you know, not frustration of, okay, we didn't find this. What's another term we could use? Or maybe we need to broaden the search a bit, take a term off of there. Maybe the date range is too narrow. So I try to have those as well, and that way I can kind of demonstrate to the students, here's how I would approach this if like I had this question at the info desk, you know, and that way they don't think that somehow magically you get the answer right the first time every time.
All right, and then one more for today. What method or activity would you recommend prioritizing if a librarian's just working with one shot and can't offer a full course?
Sure. That's one of the toughest questions we get as librarians, because when you only get to see the students once, you have to kind of figure out, okay, what's the one gem you're going to show them. First of all, I'm a firm believer that if you only get to see the students once, then you should just focus on one thing. Don't try to show them 2 databases, an ILL, and maps of this and an activity, and you're going to run out of time. And you're either going to run out of time, or you're skimming the surface of each thing so quickly that the students don't see why that's valuable. So what I do is I always make sure, if I'm just going to see them once, I make sure to get a copy of the assignment that the students are working on next. So what's the next thing they're going to do? And then that's what I start to focus on. So if they have to submit an annotated bibliography, okay, so this class is working on ethnobotany. This is a course that I work with every other semester. Okay, so what are some of the topics that the students are looking at? So what I then try to do is I show them, okay, you all are going to be looking at ethnobotanical topics. Here is the #1 database to look at, and we're going to talk about sort of the reference lists and cited network reference lists, because that's where I think they can get the most value. So I show them, here's how we do a search, and then take a look. So here's a great paper. Also, here are all the papers this paper referenced, and here's all the authors that reference this paper. So I'm showing them a resource, giving them some canned searches that I know will be valuable to them, and then showing them how that thing operates so they can see how the research sits within a larger network. And then usually I try to get them to try that on their own a little bit with their own topics, and I kind of walk around the room or have them pair up and kind of work with each other to see what they're missing. And that way they're doing some hands-on work, they're getting something that they need for their next assignment, and they're learning about a valuable resource, and I'm not bogging them down with 5, 10 other resources or services that I can always teach them about, hopefully in the future in another class, or hopefully through an online video or a visit to their class near the end of the semester. So I try to just focus on one thing and make sure that it's valuable to them on their upcoming assignment.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Dan. This was a great session. We're getting a lot of comments and feedback about it being super helpful, informative, insightful. So I'd imagine people are going to be getting in touch. So
that sounds great.
Thank you for sharing your contact details as well.
Of course, yeah, and feel free to reach out to me. I have many responsibilities. I may not get back to you right away, but I promise I will get back to you soon. So I really appreciate you all attending today, and I hope that you have a really positive takeaway from this.
Great. And if you folks like today's presentation, we do run a lot of webinars. We hope to see you at one of our future ones. So our next webinar is going to be hosted by our InfoLit Learning community on February 28th. We'll be joined with Shauna Thorpe, who's the head of reference and instruction at Arkansas Community College. And she's going to share her collaborative experience with a science professor to create a shared information literacy rubric for introductory anatomy classes. And again, as a reminder of today's webinar, there will be a recording of the webinar sent to you within 24 hours. And you'll also get a short survey. We'd greatly appreciate you completing that. And you'll also be able to let us know at that point if you're interested in getting the slides from today's session, and we'll make sure to get those to you. So we thank you again, and we hope to see you at a future session. Have a great afternoon, everyone, and thanks again, Dan.
Thank you. You're welcome.